A little background first. Let me set the stage. I live in New York City, specifically in a modest apartment in the East Village. For those unfamiliar with NYC, the East Village is known for its vibrant nightlife, diverse culture, and of course, its old buildings. Many of these structures have been around since the early 1900s, and while they have character, they also have a lot of quirks, creaky floors, drafty windows, and often some shady histories. My apartment is on the third floor of a 5-story walk-up. It's a typical NYC apartment, small but cozy. I've lived there for about 5 years now, and up until this incident, I never had any major issues. The neighborhood is generally safe, bustling with people at all hours of the day and night. The beginning of the end. It all started on a cold November evening. I remember it vividly because it was the first night the temperature had really dropped. I was home alone, bundled up in a blanket, binge-watching some Netflix series. My girlfriend Jenna was out of town visiting her parents, so I had the place to myself. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, locked the door, and went to bed. My bedroom window faces an alleyway between my building and the next. It's a narrow, dark gap, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. The windows on the opposite building are so close that you can practically see into them. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch scraping against the window, but then it happened again, more deliberate this time. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race. The sound was coming from my window, the man in the window. I slowly got out of bed and crept towards the window. Peering through the blinds, I saw nothing at first. Just the dark alleyway and the dim light from the street lamp casting eerie shadows. Then as my eyes adjusted, I saw him. A man was standing in the alleyway, staring directly at me. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a pale complexion. His clothes were tattered, and his hair was a wild, matted mess. But what struck me the most was his expression. It was a twisted grin, almost as if he knew something I didn't. I froze, unable to look away. He just stood there, staring up at my window, that creepy grin never wavering. Then slowly, he raised his hand and tapped on the window again. Tap, tap, tap. A night of terror. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I snapped out of it and stumbled back, tripping over the edge of my bed. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. 911. What's your emergency? There's a man outside my window, I whispered, glancing back towards the window. He's just standing there, staring at me. The operator tried to calm me down, assuring me that help was on the way. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes boring into me. I stayed on the line, pacing back and forth, my eyes darting to the window every few seconds. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They checked the alleyway and the surrounding area, but found no trace of him. They assured me it was probably just a homeless person looking for a place to stay warm, and advised me to keep my windows locked and my blinds closed. The following days. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my blinds tightly shut and double-checked the locks on my windows and doors. Jenna returned from her trip, and I told her what had happened. She was understandably freaked out, but tried to reassure me that it was probably just a one-time thing. But it wasn't. A week later, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was around midnight. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when the sound echoed through the apartment. Tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold. I didn't need to look to know he was back. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. This pattern continued for weeks. Every few nights, the tapping would return. Sometimes, he would stand in the alleyway, staring up at my window. Other times, I would catch glimpses of him in the shadows, lurking just out of sight. I became paranoid, barely sleeping, and constantly on edge. Jenna suggested we move, but finding a new apartment in NYC is no small feat. Besides, a part of me felt like running away wouldn't solve the problem. This man, whoever he was, seemed to know exactly where to find me. The break-in. The breaking point came on a stormy night in December. The wind was howling, and rain was pelting against the windows. Jenna and I were in bed, trying to sleep, when we heard a loud crash from the living room. We both shot up, our hearts pounding. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and cautiously made my way towards the noise. Jenna followed close behind, clutching her phone with 911 ready to dial. As we reached the living room, we saw the source of the noise. The window was shattered, and cold rain was pouring in. Then I saw him. The man was inside our apartment, standing in the middle of the room, soaked and wild-eyed. He wasn't grinning anymore. His face was contorted with rage, and he was holding a large knife. "Get out!" I shouted, brandishing the bat. "I'm calling the police." He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us with those haunting eyes. Jenna was already on the phone with 911, screaming for help. I took a step forward, trying to appear brave, but my hands were shaking. "Leave now," I yelled again, my voice cracking. Finally, he moved, but instead of running, he lunged at me with the knife. I swung the bat, barely missing his head. He swung again, and this time I connected, hitting him in the shoulder. He stumbled back, dropping the knife, and fled through the broken window. The police arrived minutes later, but it felt like an eternity. They searched the area, but found no sign of him. They took our statements and promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood, but their reassurances did little to calm our nerves. The aftermath, the days that followed, were a blur. We had the window repaired, installed security cameras, and changed the locks. But the sense of safety we once felt in our home was gone. Jenna moved in with a friend temporarily, unable to stay in the apartment. I couldn't blame her. I became obsessed. The police had no leads, no suspects, and no explanations. The private investigator hit a dead end as well. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. The only thing I had were the grainy security camera footage and my own haunting memories. A city that never sleeps. Living in New York City, you become accustomed to a certain level of chaos. The city is alive 24/7, with people coming and going at all hours. You hear stories about the strange and unsettling things that happen here, but you never think it will happen to you. The East Village, with its narrow streets and old buildings, can be a bit eerie at night. But I never imagined I would experience something like this. It's the kind of story you hear in urban legends or horror movies, not real life. But it happened, and it left a mark on me that will never fade. Moving forward. It's been a year since that night, and I wish I could say things have gotten better. Jenna and I eventually moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, hoping for a fresh start, but the memories still linger. I still hear the tapping in my dreams, and sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those haunting eyes staring back at me. I've tried to move on, to focus on the positive aspects of life, but it's not easy. The fear is always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Every time I hear a strange noise or see a shadow move, my heart races, and I'm back in that moment, facing the man in the window. Conclusion. I don't know who he was or why he chose to terrorize us. Maybe he was just a disturbed individual looking for a thrill, or perhaps there was something more sinister at play. I'll probably never know. But I do know that the experience changed me. It made me more aware, more cautious, and more appreciative of the moments of peace and safety we often take for granted. So, if you ever hear a tap on your window in the middle of the night, don't ignore it. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and always trust your instincts. You never know what kind of darkness might be lurking just outside your window. First, let me set the stage. I live in New York City, specifically in the East Village. For those who don't know, the East Village is known for its vibrant nightlife, diverse community, and historic buildings. The area has a certain charm, with its old brownstones, narrow streets, and the ever-present hum of city life. But like any part of NYC, it has its dark corners. I moved into a small apartment on the third floor of a pre-war building. It was a typical New York apartment, small, cozy, with a lot of character. The kind of place that makes you feel connected to the city's history. My apartment faced an alleyway, a narrow gap between buildings that was always shrouded in shadows, even during the day. It was just wide enough for a person to walk through, but you rarely saw anyone there. The first encounter. It all started on a chilly October night. I had been living in the apartment for a few months and was starting to feel settled in. That night, I was working late on a project for my job, sitting at my desk by the window that faced the alley. It was around 1 a.m. when I first heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch scraping against the window, but then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. I looked out the window, expecting to see nothing but the usual darkness. Instead, I saw a figure standing in the alley. It was a man, tall and thin, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. He was staring directly at me. My heart skipped a beat. The man stood perfectly still, almost as if he was a statue. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly raised his hand and tapped on the window again. Tap, tap, tap. I was frozen in place, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do. Should I call the police? Should I confront him? Before I could make a decision, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. I closed the blinds and tried to convince myself that it was just a random encounter, a one-time thing. But deep down, I knew better. The escalation. Over the next few weeks, the tapping continued. It always happened late at night, around the same time. I would hear the sound, look out the window, and see the same man standing there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Each time, he would tap on the window, then vanish into the darkness. I started to become paranoid. I couldn't sleep, constantly on edge, waiting for the next time I would hear the tapping. I told my friends about it, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just a homeless person looking for a place to stay warm. But I knew it was more than that. The way he looked at me, it felt personal, almost like he was trying to send a message. One night, I decided to confront him. I was tired of living in fear and wanted to put an end to it. Around 1 a.m., I heard the tapping again. This time, I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and headed down to the alley. As I approached the window, I saw the man standing there, just like before. I took a deep breath and opened the window. "What do you want?" I shouted, shining the flashlight directly at him. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at me with that same eerie smile. "Leave me alone," I yelled, my voice shaking. Without saying a word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows once again. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt a sense of relief, hoping that confronting him would make him go away. But I was wrong. The break-in. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed. I cautiously made my way to the living room, where I saw the source of the noise. The window was broken, glass shards scattered across the floor. Cold air was pouring in, and the curtains were billowing in the wind. I called 911, my hands trembling as I held the phone. The operator assured me that the police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity before they arrived. I stood there, gripping the bat tightly, my eyes darting around the room, half expecting the man to jump out at any moment. When the police finally arrived, they searched the apartment and the surrounding area, but found no sign of the man. They told me it was likely a random break-in attempt and advised me to install better locks and security cameras. I followed their advice, hoping it would be enough to keep him out. The obsession. Despite the new locks and cameras, the feeling of being watched never went away. Every night, I would hear the tapping, see the man in the alley, and feel that same sense of dread. It was as if he was taunting me, letting me know that he could get to me whenever he wanted. I became obsessed with finding out who he was and why he was targeting me. I spent hours researching, looking for any clues or similar incidents in the area. I talked to my neighbors, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The police had no leads, and the security camera footage always showed the same thing, the man standing in the alley, staring at my window. One night, as I was reviewing the footage for the 100th time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was another figure. It was a woman, standing just out of sight, watching the man. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked like she was from another era. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who was she? And why was she watching him? I zoomed in on the image, but it was too blurry to make out any details. I printed out a still from the footage and took it to the police, hoping it would help. They promised to look into it, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. The discovery. As the weeks went by, the situation only got worse. The tapping became more frequent, sometimes happening multiple times a night. I started to see the man during the day, standing in the alley, watching me as I left for work or came home. It was as if he was always there, lurking in the shadows. One evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I went down to the alley and searched for any clues. As I walked through the narrow passage, I noticed something odd. There was a small, hidden door in the wall, partially obscured by a pile of garbage. I pushed the debris aside and tried the handle. It was locked, but I could feel a cold draft coming from inside. I went back to my apartment and grabbed a screwdriver, determined to see what was behind the door. It took some effort, but I managed to pry it open. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I felt a surge of fear, but also a sense of curiosity. I had to know what was down there. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the stairs. The air was damp and musty, and the sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the corner, there was a small table with a stack of old newspapers and a journal. I picked up the journal and started to read. It belonged to a woman named Eliza, who had lived in the building during the 1920s. She wrote about her life, her struggles, and her fears. As I read, I realized that the man in the alley was mentioned several times. Eliza described him as a shadowy figure who would appear outside her window, tapping and watching her. My heart raced as I read the final entry. Eliza wrote about how the man had broken into her apartment one night and how she had fled to the basement, hoping to escape. She never wrote again after that. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Was the woman in the security footage Eliza? And was the man the same one who had terrorized her nearly a century ago? The confrontation. Armed with this new information, I went to the police again, but they were skeptical. They chalked it up to urban legends and the ramblings of a disturbed mind. Frustrated and scared, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't live like this anymore. One night I set a trap. I left my apartment and waited in the alley, hiding in the shadows. Around 1 a.m., I heard the tapping. I crept towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rounded the corner, I saw him. The man was standing at my window, his hand raised, ready to tap again. I shouted at him, and he turned to face me. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. I lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. He struggled, but I managed to pin him down. As I held him there, I saw the woman again, standing at the end of the alley. She looked at me with a sad expression, then slowly faded away. The police arrived moments later and took the man into custody. They found no identification on him, and he refused to speak. He was taken to a psychiatric facility for evaluation, but I never heard what happened to him after that. The police assured me that he wouldn't be able to harm me again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The aftermath. After the man was taken away, the tapping stopped. The feeling of being watched slowly faded, but the memories lingered. I moved out of the apartment and found a new place in a different part of the city, hoping for a fresh start. But the fear followed me. I installed security cameras, triple-checked the locks on my doors and windows, and avoided being alone at night. I couldn't escape the sense of being watched, the memory of those hollow eyes and that twisted smile haunting my every move. I became paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, never feeling truly safe. Conclusion: I still don't know who the man was or why he targeted me. Maybe he was a disturbed individual, or perhaps there was something more sinister at play. I may never know the truth, but I do know that the experience changed me. It made me more aware, more cautious, and more appreciative of the moments of peace and safety we often take for granted. So, if you ever hear a tap on your window in the middle of the night, don't ignore it. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and always trust your instincts. You never know what kind of darkness might be lurking just outside your window. Setting the scene. I live in New York City, specifically in a pre-war building in the Upper West Side. For those unfamiliar, the Upper West Side is a beautiful area, known for its historic brownstones, tree-lined streets, and proximity to Central Park. It's a part of the city that feels a bit like stepping back in time, with its old-world charm and quieter vibe compared to other parts of Manhattan. My apartment is on the 4th floor of a 6-story building. It's one of those old buildings with character, creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light during the day. At night, though, those same windows can make you feel incredibly exposed. The first signs. It all began in late September, just as the leaves were starting to turn. I had just moved into the apartment a couple of months prior and was still getting used to the new neighborhood. The initial excitement of living in a historic building had me overlooking some of the quirks, like the old heating system that clanked loudly, or the occasional draft from the windows. One evening, after a long day at work, I settled in to watch a movie. I remember it was unusually quiet that night, the kind of silence that feels almost unnatural in a city that never sleeps. About halfway through the movie, I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was part of the film, but then I realized it was coming from outside my window. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. I paused the movie and listened. Tap, tap, tap. It was so faint that I thought it might be a branch from a nearby tree hitting the window. I dismissed it and went back to watching my movie, but the sound persisted. Tap, tap, tap. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain, expecting to see a branch or maybe a bird. Instead, I saw nothing, just the empty street below, dimly lit by the orange glow of the street lamps. The tapping had stopped as soon as I approached the window. I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and went back to the couch, the feeling of being watched. Over the next few weeks, the tapping became a regular occurrence, always late at night, always faint. I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. It's a hard feeling to describe, but it was as if a pair of eyes were constantly on me, following my every move. I tried to rationalize it, blaming the old building and my overactive imagination. One night, I was up late working on a project for my job. It was around 2 a.m. and the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I turned off all the lights in the apartment, hoping to see better outside without the glare from inside. As I approached the window, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Across the street, in a darkened window of the building opposite mine, I saw a figure. It was just standing there, perfectly still, looking directly at my apartment. The window was on the same floor as mine, and the figure was silhouetted against the faint light from the street. I stood there frozen, staring back. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just a trick of the light? Was someone really watching me? The figure didn't move, didn't waver. After what felt like an eternity, I closed the curtain and backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The police involvement. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to talk to the building superintendent, an elderly man named Frank, who had been working there for decades. I asked him if he had noticed anything strange or if anyone had reported similar incidents. Frank shook his head and told me he hadn't heard of anything unusual. Feeling frustrated and slightly paranoid, I decided to report the incident to the police. I didn't have much to go on, just a vague description of a figure in a window. The officer I spoke to was polite, but seemed skeptical. He took my statement and promised to have a patrol car swing by the area more frequently at night. For a while, things seemed to quiet down. The tapping stopped, and I began to feel a bit more at ease. But the sense of being watched never truly went away. I started to avoid looking out the window at night, afraid of what I might see. The break-in. A couple of months passed, and the incident had started to fade from my mind. It was mid-November, and the city was starting to get colder. One night, I returned home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart sank. I knew I had locked it before I left. I pushed the door open slowly, my hands trembling. The apartment was dark, and the silence was deafening. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. The place looked undisturbed at first glance, but then I noticed the window. It was wide open, the cold night air flooding in. My mind raced with thoughts of intruders and possible hiding places. I grabbed a heavy bookend from the shelf and cautiously moved through the apartment, checking every room, every closet. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. The officers searched the apartment and confirmed there were no signs of forced entry. They suggested that maybe I had forgotten to lock the door, or that the wind had blown the window open. But I knew better. Someone had been inside my home. The discovery. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle had me on edge. I started to notice things out of place. Small objects moved, drawers slightly open. I became convinced that someone was coming into my apartment while I was at work. I decided to set up a hidden camera in the living room, aimed at the window. If someone was coming in, I wanted to catch them on tape. For a few days, there was nothing. Then, one evening, I reviewed the footage and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the night, the window slowly creaked open. A figure slipped inside, moving with an eerie grace. They stood there for a moment, looking around the apartment, before slowly making their way to my bedroom door. The camera didn't capture what happened next, but it was enough. Someone had been inside my home, watching me as I slept. I took the footage to the police, and this time, they took it seriously. They increased patrols in the area and promised to keep a closer watch on my building. But despite their efforts, the feeling of being watched never went away. The confrontation. The final straw came one snowy night in December. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard the tapping again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I knew I had to confront whoever it was. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy wrench from my toolbox and approached the window. I threw open the curtain and shone the flashlight outside. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure was standing in the alleyway below, looking up at my window with that same unnerving stillness. My hand shook as I pointed the light at them, and for the first time, I saw their face. It was a man, probably in his late 40s, with pale skin and hollow eyes. He looked gaunt, almost skeletal, and his clothes were dirty and torn. But what struck me the most was his expression. It was a twisted smile, one that sent a shiver down my spine. I shouted at him to leave, my voice cracking with fear. But he didn't move. He just stood there, smiling up at me. In a fit of desperation, I called the police, my eyes never leaving the man. When the officers arrived, the man was gone, vanished into the shadows of the city. The aftermath. The police launched an investigation, but they never found the man. I moved out of the apartment shortly after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I found a new place in a different part of the city, hoping for a fresh start. But the fear followed me. I installed security cameras, triple-checked the locks on my doors and windows, and avoided being alone at night. I couldn't escape the sense of being watched, the memory of those hollow eyes and that twisted smile haunting my every move. I've tried to move on with my life, to focus on the positive aspects of living in this incredible city. But it's not easy. The fear is always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Every time I hear a strange noise or see a shadow move, my heart races, and I'm back in that moment, facing the man in the window. Conclusion. I don't know who he was or why he chose to terrorize me. Maybe he was just a disturbed individual looking for a thrill, or perhaps there was something more sinister at play. I'll probably never know. But I do know that the experience changed me. It made me more aware, more cautious, and more appreciative of the moments of peace and safety we often take for granted.